Hey comrades, so today we're starting part 1 of 3 of chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. This chapter is called The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. History teaches us clearly that the battle against colonialism does not run straight away along lines of nationalism. For a very long time, the native devotes his energies to ending certain definite abuses: forced labor, corporal punishment, inequality of salaries, limitation of political rights, etc. This fight for democracy against the oppression of mankind will slowly leave the confusion of neoliberal universalism to emerge, sometimes laboriously, as a claim to nationhood. It so happens that the unpreparedness of the educated classes, the lack of practical links between them and the mass of the people, their laziness, and let it be said their cowardice at the decisive moment of the struggle will give rise to tragic mishaps. National consciousness, instead of being the all-embracing crystallization of the innermost hopes of the whole people, instead of being the immediate and most obvious result of the mobilization of the people, will be in any case only an empty shell, a crude and fragile travesty of what might have been. The faults we find in it are quite sufficient explanation of the facility with which, when dealing with young and independent nations, the nation is passed over for the race, and the tribe is preferred to the state. These are the cracks in the edifice which show the process of retrogression that is so harmful and prejudicial to national effort and national unity. We shall see that such retrograde steps, with all the weaknesses and serious dangers that they entail, are the historical result of the incapacity of the national middle class to rationalize popular action. That is to say, their incapacity to see into reasons for that action. This traditional weakness, which is almost congenital to the national consciousness of underdeveloped countries, is not solely the result of the mutilation of the colonized people by the colonial regime. It is also the result of intellectual laziness of the national middle class, of its spiritual penury, and of the profoundly cosmopolitan mold that its mind is set in. The national middle class which takes over power at the end of the colonial regime is an underdeveloped middle class. It has practically no economic power, and in any case it is in no way commensurate with the bourgeoisie of the mother country, which it hopes to replace. In its narcissism, the national middle class is easily convinced that it can advantageously replace the middle class of the mother country, but the same independence which literally drives it into the corner will give rise within its ranks to catastrophic reactions. It will oblige it to send out frenzied appeals for help to the former mother country. The university and merchant classes which make up the most enlightened section of the new state are in fact characterized by the smallness of their number and their being concentrated in the capital, and the type of activities in which they are engaged: business, agriculture, and the liberal professions. Neither financiers nor industrial magnates are to be found within this national middle class. The national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is not engaged in production, nor in invention, nor building, nor labor. It is completely canalized into activities of the intermediary type. Its innermost vocation seems to be to keep in the running and to be a part of the racket. The psychology of the national bourgeoisie is that of the businessman, not of the captain of industry. And it is only too true that the greed of the settlers and the system of embargoes set up by colonialism have hardly left them any other choice. Under the colonial system, a middle class which accumulates capital is an impossible phenomenon. Now, precisely, it would seem that the historical vocation of an authentic national middle class in an underdeveloped country is to repudiate its own nature insofar as it is bourgeois. That is to say, insofar as it is the tool of capitalism, and to make itself the willing slave of that revolutionary capital which is the people. In an underdeveloped country, an authentic national middle class ought to consider as its bounden duty to betray the calling fate has marked out for it, and to put itself to school with the people. In other words, to put at the people's disposal the intellectual and technical capital that it has snatched when going through the colonial universities. But unhappily, we shall see that very often the national middle class does not follow this heroic, positive, fruitful, and just path. Rather, it disappears with its soul set at peace into the shocking ways, shocking because anti-national, of all traditional bourgeoisie, of a bourgeoisie which is stupidly, contemplatively, cynically bourgeois. The objective of nationalist parties, as from a certain given period, is, we have seen, strictly national. They mobilize the people with slogans of independence, and for the rest leave it to future events. When such parties are questioned on the economic program of the state that they are clamoring for, or on the nature of the regime which they propose to install, they are incapable of replying, because precisely they are completely ignorant of the economy of their own country. This economy has always developed outside the limits of their knowledge. They have nothing more than an approximate bookish acquaintance with the actual and potential resources of their country's soil and mineral deposits, and therefore they can only speak of these resources on a general and abstract plane. After independence, this underdeveloped middle class, reduced in numbers and without capital, which refuses to follow the path of revolution, will fall into deplorable stagnation. It is unable to give free rein to its genius which formerly it was wont to lament, though rather too glibly, was held in check by colonial domination. The precariousness of its resources and the paucency of its managerial class force it back for years into an artisan economy. From its point of view, which is inevitably a very limited one, a national economy is an economy based on what may be called local products. Long speeches will be made about the artisan class, since the middle classes find it impossible to set up factories that would be more profit-earning both for themselves and for the country as a whole. They will surround the artisan class with a chauvinistic tenderness and in keeping with a new awareness of national dignity, and which, moreover, will bring them in quite a lot of money. This cult of local products and this incapability to seek out new systems of management will be equally manifested by the bogging down of the national middle class in the methods of agricultural production, which were characteristics of the colonial period. The national economy of the period of independence is not set on a new footing. It is still concerned with the groundnut harvest, with the cocoa crop, and the olive yield. In the same way, there is no change in the marketing of basic products, and not a single industry is set up in the country. We go on setting out raw materials, we go on being Europe's small farmers who specialize in unfinished products. Yet the national middle class constantly demands the nationalization of the economy and of trading sectors. This is because, from their point of view, nationalization does not mean placing the whole economy at the service of the nation and deciding to satisfy the needs of the nation. For them, nationalization does not mean governing the state with regard to the new social relations whose growth it has been decided to encourage. To them, nationalization quite simply means the transfer into native hands of those unfair advantages which are the legacy of the colonial period. Since the middle class has neither sufficient material nor intellectual resources, by intellectual resources we mean engineers and technicians, it limits its claims to the taking over of business offices and commercial houses formerly occupied by the settlers. The national bourgeoisie steps into the shoes of the former European settlement, doctors, baristas, traders, commercial travelers, general agents, and transport agents. It considers that the dignity of the country and its own welfare require that it should occupy all these posts. From now on, it will insist that all the big foreign companies should pass through its hands, whether these companies wish to keep on their connections with the country or to open it up. The national middle class discovers its historic mission, that of the intermediary. Seen through its eyes, its mission has nothing to do with transforming the nation. It consists, prosaically, of being the transmission line between the nation and a capitalism, rampant though camouflaged, which today puts on the mask of neo-colonialism. The national bourgeoisie will be quite content with the role of the Western bourgeoisie's business agent, and it will play its part without any complexes in a most dignified manner. But this same lucrative role, this cheap jack's function, this meanness of outlook, and this absence of all ambition symbolize the incapacity of the national middle class to fulfill its historic role of bourgeoisie. Here, the dynamic pioneer aspect, the characteristics of the inventor and of the discoverer of new worlds which are found in all national bourgeoisies, are lamentably absent. In the colonial countries, the spirit of indulgence is dominant at the core of the bourgeoisie, and this is because of the national bourgeoisie identifies itself with the Western bourgeoisie, from whom it has learnt its lessons. It follows the Western bourgeoisie along its path of negation and decadence without ever having emulated its first stages of exploration and invention, the stages which are an acquisition of that Western bourgeoisie, whatever the circumstances. In its beginnings, the national bourgeoisie of the colonial countries identifies itself with the decadence of the bourgeoisie of the West. We need not to think that it is jumping ahead. It is in fact beginning at the end. It is already senile before it has come to know of the petulance, the fearlessness, or the will to succeed of youth. The national bourgeoisie will be greatly helped on its way toward decadence by Western bourgeoisies, who come into it as tourists, avid for the exotic, for big game hunting, and for casinos. The national bourgeoisie organizes centers of rest and relaxation and pleasure resorts to meet the wishes of the Western bourgeoisie. Such activity is given the name of tourism, and for the occasion we be built up as a national industry. If proof is needed of the eventual transformation of certain elements of ex-native bourgeoisie into the organizers of parties for their Western opposite numbers, it is worthwhile having a look at what happened in Latin America. The casinos of Havana and of Mexico, the beaches of Rio, the little Brazilian and Mexican girls, the half-breed 13-year-olds, the port of Apalaco and Copacabana, all these are the stigma of this deprivation of the national middle class, because it is bereft of ideas, because it lives to itself and cuts itself off from the people, undermined by its hereditary incapacity to think in terms of all problems of the nation. As seen from the point of view of the whole of the nation, the national middle class will have nothing better to do than to take on the role of manager for Western enterprise, and it will, in practice, set up its country as a brothel of Europe. Once again, we must keep before us the unfortunate example of certain Latin American republics. The banking magnates, the technocrats, and the big businessmen of the United States have only to step onto a plane and they are wafted into subtropical climes, there for a space of a week or 10 days, to luxuriate in the delicious depravities which their quote-unquote reserves hold for them. The behavior of the national landed proprietors is practically identical with that of the middle class of the towns. The big farmers have, as soon as independence is proclaimed, demanded the nationalization of agricultural production. Through manifold scheming practices, they managed to make a clean sweep of the farms formerly owned by settlers, thus reinforcing their hold on the district. But they do not try to introduce new agricultural methods, nor to farm more intensively, nor to integrate their farming systems into a generally national economy. In fact, the landed proprietors will insist that the state should give them 100 times more facilities and privileges than they were enjoyed by the foreign settlers in former times. The exploitation of agricultural workers will be intensified and made legitimate. Using 2 or 3 slogans, these new colonists will demand an enormous amount of work from their agricultural labors, in the name of the national effort, of course. There will be no modernization of agriculture, no planning for development, and no initiative, for initiative throws these people into a panic. It implies a minimum of risk and completely upsets the hesitant, prudent, landed bourgeoisie, which gradually slips more and more into the lines of laid down by colonialism. In the districts where this is the case, the only efforts made to better things are due to the government. It orders them, encourages them, and finances them. The landed bourgeoisie refuses to take the slightest risk and remains opposed to any venture and to any hazard. It has no intention of building upon sand. It demands solid investments and quick returns. The enormous profit which it pockets, enormous if we take into account the national revenue, are never reinvested. The money in the stocking mentality is dominant in the psychology of these landed proprietors, sometimes, especially in the years immediately following independence. The bourgeoisie does not hesitate to invest in foreign banks the profit that it makes out of native soil. On the other hand, large sums are spent on display. on cars, country houses, and on all those things which have been justly described by economists as characterizing an undeveloped bourgeoisie. We have said that the native bourgeoisie which comes to power uses its class aggressiveness to corner the positions formerly kept for foreigners. On the morrow of independence, in fact, it violently attacks colonial personalities, barristers, traders, landed proprietors, doctors, and higher civil servants. It will fight to the bitter end against these people, quote, who insult our dignity as a nation, end quote. It waves aloft the notion of the nationalization and Africanization of the ruling class. The fact is that such action will become more and more tinged by racism, until the bourgeoisie bluntly puts the problem to the government by saying, quote unquote, we must have these posts. They will not stop their snarling until they have taken over everyone. The working class of the towns, the masses of unemployed, the small artisans and craftsmen, for their part, line up behind this nationalist attitude. But in all justice, let it be said, they only follow in the steps of their bourgeoisie. If the national bourgeoisie goes into competition with the Europeans, the artisans and craftsmen start a fight against non-national Africans. In the Ivory Coast, the anti-Daomen and anti-Voltaic troubles are in fact racial riots. The Daomen and Voltaic peoples, who control the greater part of the petty trade, are, once independence is declared, the object of hostile manifestations on the part of the people of the Ivory Coast. From nationalism, we have passed to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. These foreigners are called on to leave, their shops are burned, their street stalls are wrecked, and in fact, the government of the Ivory Coast commands them to go, thus giving their national satisfaction. In Senegal, it is the anti-Sudanese demonstrations which call forth these words from Mr. Mamadou Dia, quote, the truth is that the Senegalese people have only adopted the Mali mystique through attachment to its leaders. Their adhesion to the Mali has no other significance than that of a fresh act of faith in these political policies of the latter. The Senegalese territory was no less real. In fact, it was all the more so in the presence of the Sudanese in Dakar, was too obviously manifested for it to be forgotten. It is this fact which explains that, far from being regretted, the breakup of the Federation has been greeted with relief by the mass of people, and nowhere was a hand raised to maintain it. End quote. While certain sections of the Senegalese people jump at the chance which is afforded to them by their own leaders to get rid of the Sudanese who hamper them in commercial matters or in administrative posts, the Congolese who stood by, hardly daring to believe in the mass exodus of the Belgians, decide to bring pressure to bear on the Senegalese who have settled in Leopoldville and Elizabethville and get them to leave. As we see it, the mechanism is identical in the two sets of circumstances. If the Europeans get in the way of the intellectuals and business bourgeoisie of the young nation, for the mass of the people in the towns, competition is represented principally by Africans of another nation. On the Ivory Coast, these competitors are the Daomens. In Ghana, they are Nigerians. In Senegal, they are Sudanese. When the bourgeoisie's demands for a ruling class made up exclusively of Negroes or Arabs do not spring from an authentic movement of nationalization, but merely correspond to an anxiety to place on the bourgeoisie's hand the power held hitherto by the foreigner, the masses on their level present the same demands, confining, however, the notion of Negro or Arab within certain territorial limits. Between resounding assertions of the unity of the continent and this behavior of the masses, which has its inspiration in their leaders, many different attitudes may be traced. We observe a permanent seesaw between African unity, which fades quicker and quicker into the mist of oblivion, and a heartbreaking return to chauvinism in its most bitter and detestable form. On the Senegalese side, the leaders who have been the main theoreticians of African unity and who several times have sacrificed their local political organizations and their personal positions to this idea are, though in all good faith, undeniably responsible. Their mistake, our mistake, has been, under pretext of fighting quote-unquote balkanization, not to have taken into consideration the pre-colonial fact of the territorialism. Our mistake has been not to have paid enough attention to our analysis of this phenomenon, which is the fruit of colonialism, if you like, but also a sociological fact which no theory of unity, be it ever so laudable or attractive, can abolish. We have allowed ourselves to be seduced by a mirage, that of the structure which is the most pleasing to our minds, and, mistaking our ideal for reality, we have believed it enough to condemn territorialism and its natural sequel, micronationalism, for us to get the better of them, and to assure the success of our chimeral undertaking. From the chauvinism of the Senegalese to the tribalism of the Wolofs is not a big step, for in fact, everywhere that the national bourgeoisie has failed to break through to the people as a whole, to enlighten them, and consider all problems in the first place with regard to them, a failure due to the bourgeoisie's attitude of mistrust and the haziness of its political tenets, everywhere that national bourgeoisie has shown itself incapable of extending its vision of the world sufficiently, we observe a falling back toward the old tribal attitudes, and, furious and sick at heart, we perceive that race feeling in its most exacerbated form is triumphing. Since the sole motto of the bourgeoisie is, quote, replace the foreigner, end quote, and because it hastens in every walk of life to secure justice for itself and to take over the posts that the foreigner has vacated, the quote-unquote small people of the nation, taxi drivers, cake sellers, and boot blackers, will be equally quick to insist that the Dalomans go home to their own country, or will even go further and demand that the Fulbis and the Paloons return to their jungle or the mountains. It is from this viewpoint that we must interpret the fact that in young independent countries, here and there, federalism triumphs. We know that colonial domination has marked certain regions out for privilege. The colony's economy is not integrated into that of the nation as a whole. It is still organized in order to complete the economy of the different mother countries. Colonialism hardly ever exploits the whole of a country. It contents with itself with bringing to light the national resources which it extracts and exports to meet the needs of the mother country's industries, thereby allowing certain sectors of the colony to become relatively rich. But the rest of the colony follows its path of underdevelopment and of poverty, or at all events sink into it more deeply. Immediately after independence, the nationals who live in the more prosperous regions realize their good luck and show a primary and profound reaction in refusing to feed the other nationals. The districts which are rich in groundnuts, in cocoa, and diamonds come to the forefront and dominate the empty panorama which the rest of the nation presents. The nationals of these rich regions look upon the others with hatred, and find in them envy and covetousness, and homicidal impulses. Old rivalries, which were before colonialism, old interracial hatreds, come to the surface. The Balabas refuse to feed the Lulas. Kantaga forms itself into a state, and Albert Kalonji gets himself crowned king of South Kasai. African unity, that vague formula, yet one to which the men and women of Africa were passionately attached, and whose operative value served to bring immense pressure to bear on colonialism, African unity takes off the mask and crumbles into regionalism inside the hollow shell of nationality itself. The national bourgeoisie, since it is strung up to defend its immediate interests and sees no further than the end of its nose, reveals itself incapable of simply bringing national unity into being, or of building up the nation on a stable and productive basis. The National Front, which has forced colonialism to withdraw, cracks up and wastes the victory it has gained. This merciless fight, engaged upon by races and tribes, and this aggressive anxiety to occupy the posts left vacant by the departure of the foreigner, will equally give rise to religious rivalries. In the country districts and the bush, minor confraternities, local religions, and maraboutic cults will show a new vitality and will once more take up their round of excommunications. In the big towns, on the level of the administrative classes, we will observe the coming into grips of the two great revealed religions, Islam and Catholicism. Colonialism, which has been shaken to its very foundations by the birth of African unity, recovers its balance and now tries to break that will to unity by using all the movement's weaknesses. Colonialism will set the African peoples moving by revealing to them the existence of quote-unquote spiritual rivalries. In Senegal, it is the newspaper New Africa which week by week distills hatred of Islam and of the Arabs. The Lebanese, in whose hands is the greater part of the small trading enterprises on the western seaboard, are marked out for national obloquy. The missionaries find it opportune to remind the masses that long before the advent of European colonialism, the great African empires were disrupted by the Arab invasion. There is no hesitation in saying that it was the Arab occupation which paved the way for European colonialism. Arab imperialism is commonly spoken of, and the cultural imperialism of Islam is condemned. Muslims are usually kept out of the more important posts. In other regions of the reverse is the case, and it is the native Christians who are considered as conscious, objective enemies of national independence. Colonialism pulls every string shamelessly and is only too content to set at loggerheads those Africans who only yesterday were leagued against the settlers. The idea of St. Bartholomew takes shape in certain minds, and the advocates of colonialism laugh to themselves derisively when they hear magnificent declarations about African unity. Inside a single nation, religion splits up the people into different spiritual communities, all of them kept up and stiffened by colonialism and its instruments. Totally unexpected events break out here and there. In regions where Catholicism or Protestant predominates, we see the Muslim minorities flinging themselves with unaccustomed ardor into their devotions. The Islamic feast days are revived, and the Muslim religion defends itself inch by inch against the violent absolutism of the Catholic faith. Ministers of the state are heard to say, for the benefit of certain individuals, that if they are not content, they have only to go to Cairo. Sometimes American Protestantism transplants its anti-Catholic prejudices into African soil and keeps up tribal rivalries through religion. Taking the continent as a whole, this religious tension may be responsible for the revival of the communist racial feeling. Africa is divided into black and white, and the names that are substituted, Africa south of the Sahara, Africa north of the Sahara, do not manage to hide this latent racism. Here it is affirmed that white Africa has a 1,000-year-old tradition of culture, that she is Mediterranean, that she is a continuation of Europe, and that she shares in Greco-Latin civilization. Black Africa is looked on as a region that is inert, brutal, uncivilized, in a word, savage. There, all day long, you may hear unpleasant remarks about veiled women, polygamy, and the supposed disdain the Arabs have for the feminine sex. All such remarks are reminiscent in their aggressiveness of those that are so often heard coming from the settlers' lips. The national bourgeoisie of each of these two great regions, which has totally assimilated colonialist thought in its most corrupt form, takes over from the Europeans and establishes in the continent a racial philosophy which is extremely harmful for the future of Africa. By its laziness and will to imitation, it promotes the ingrafting and stiffening of racism, which was characteristic of the colonial era. Thus, it by no means astonishing to hear, in the country that calls itself African, remarks which are neither more nor less than racist, and to observe the existence of paternalist behavior which gives you the bitter impression that you are in Paris, Brussels, or London. In certain regions of Africa, driveling paternalism with regard to the blacks, and the loathsome idea derived from Western culture that the black man is impervious to logic, and the science reign in all their nakedness, sometimes it may be ascertained that the black minorities are hemmed in by a kind of semi-slavery which renders legitimate that species of wariness, or in other words, mistrust, which the countries of Black Africa feel with regard to the countries of White Africa. It is all too common that a citizen of Black Africa hears himself called a quote-unquote Negro by the children when walking in the streets of a big town in White Africa, or finds that civil servants address him in pidgin English. Yes, unfortunately it is not unknown that students from Black Africa who attend secondary schools north of the Sahara hear their school fellows asking if in their country there are houses, if they know what electricity is, or if they practice cannibalism in their families. Yes, unfortunately it is not unknown that in certain regions north of the Sahara, Africans coming from countries south of the Sahara meet nationals who implore them to take them, quote, anywhere at all on the condition we meet Negroes, end quote. In parallel fashion, in certain young states of Black Africa, members of parliament or even ministers maintain without a trace of humor that the danger is not at all of reoccupation of their country by colonialism, but of an eventual invasion by, quote, those vandals of Arabs coming from the north, end quote. As we see it, the bankruptcy of the bourgeoisie is not apparent in the economic field only. They have come to power in the name of a narrow nationalism and representing a race. They will prove themselves incapable of triumphantly putting into practice a program with even a minimal humanist content, in spite of fine-sounding declarations which are devoid of meaning, since the speakers bandy about in irresponsible fashion phrases that come straight out of European treaties on morals and political philosophy. When the bourgeoisie is strong, when it can arrange everything and everybody to serve its power, it does not hesitate to affirm positively certain democratic ideas which claim to be universally applicable. There must be very exceptional circumstances if such a bourgeoisie solidly based economically is forced into denying its own humanist ideology. The Western bourgeoisie, though fundamentally racist, most often manages to mask this racism by a multiplicity of nuances, which allow it to preserve intact its proclamation of mankind's outstanding dignity. The Western bourgeoisie has prepared enough fences and railings to have no real fear of the competition of those whom it exploits and holds in contempt. Western bourgeois racial prejudice as regards to the N-word and the Arab is a racism of contempt. It is a racism which minimizes what it hates. Bourgeois ideology, however, which is the proclamation of an essential equality between men, manages to appear logical in its own eyes by inviting the sub-men to become human, and it takes as their prototype Western humanity as incarnated with the Western bourgeoisie. The racial prejudice of the young national bourgeoisie is a racism of defense, based on fear. Essentially, it is no different from the vulgar tribalism or the rivalries between septs or confraternities. We may understand why keen-witted international observers have hardly taken seriously the great flights of oratory about African unity, or for it is that there are so many cracks in the unity visible to the naked eye that it is only reasonable to insist that all these contradictions ought to be resolved before the day of unity can come. The peoples of Africa have only recently come to know themselves. They have decided in the name of the whole continent to weigh in strongly against the colonial regime. Now the nationalist bourgeoisies, who in region after region hasten to make their own fortunes and to set up a national system of exploitation, do their utmost to put obstacles in the path of this quote-unquote utopia. The national bourgeoisies, who are quite clear as to what their objectives are, have decided to bar the way to that unity, to that coordinated effort on the part of 250 million men who triumph over stupidity, hunger, and inhumanity, and one at the same time. This is why we must understand that African unity can only be achieved through the upward thrust of the people, and under the leadership of the people, that is to say, in defiance of the interests of the bourgeoisie. As regard to internal affairs and in the sphere of institutions, the national bourgeoisie will give equal proof of its incapacity. In a certain number of underdeveloped countries, the parliamentary game is faked from the beginning. Powerless economically, unable to bring about the existence of coherent social relations, and standing on the principle of its domination as a class, the bourgeoisie chooses the solution that seems to it the easiest, that of the single party. It does not yet have the quiet conscience and the calm that economic power and the control of the state machine alone can give. It does not create a state that reassures the ordinary citizen, but rather one that rouses his anxiety. The state, which by its strength and discretion ought to inspire confidence and disarm and lull every one to sleep, on the contrary, seeks to impose itself in spectacular fashion. It makes a display, it jostles people and bullies them, thus intimidating to the citizen that he is in continual danger. The single party is the modern form of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, unmasked, unpainted, unscrupulous, and cynical. It is true that such a dictatorship does not go very far. It cannot halt the process of its own contradictions. Since the bourgeoisie has not the economic means to ensure its domination and to throw a few crumbs to the rest of the country, since, moreover, it is preoccupied with filling its pockets as rapidly as possible, it also as prosaitically as possible, the country sinks all the more deeply into stagnation. And in order to hide this stagnation and to mark its regression, to reassure itself and to give itself something to boast about, the bourgeoisie can find nothing better to do than erect grandiose buildings in the capital and to lay out money on what are called prestigious expenses. The national bourgeoisie turns its back more and more on the interior and on the real facts of its underdeveloped country, and tends to look toward the former mother country and the former capitalists who count on its obliging compliance. As it does not share its profits with the people, and in no way allows them to enjoy any of the dues that are paid to it by the big foreign companies, it will discover the need for a popular leader who will fill the dual role of stabilizing the regime and of perpetuating the domination of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois dictatorship of underdeveloped countries draws its strength from the existence of a leader. We know that in the well-developed countries, the bourgeois dictatorship is the result of the economic power of the bourgeoisie. In the underdeveloped countries, on the contrary, the leader stands for moral power, in whose shelter the thin and poverty-stricken bourgeoisie of the young nation decides to get rich. The people who for years on end have seen this leader and heard him speak, who, from a distance, in a kind of dream, have followed his contest with the colonial power, spontaneously put their trust in this patriot. Before independence, the leader generally embodies the aspirations of the people for independence, political liberty, and national dignity. As soon as independence is declared, far from embodying in concrete form the needs of the people in what touches bread, land, and the restoration of the country to the sacred hands of the people, the leader will reveal his inner purpose, to become the general president of that company of profiteers impatient for their returns which constitutes the national bourgeoisie. In spite of his frequently honest conduct and his sincere declarations, the leader, as seen objectively, is the fierce defender of these interests, today combined, of the national bourgeoisie and the ex-colonial companies. His honesty, which is his soul's true bent, crumbles away little by little. His contact with the masses is so unreal that he comes to believe that his authority is hated and that the services that he has rendered his country are being called in question. The leader judges the ingratitude of the masses harshly, and every day that passes ranges himself a little more resolutely on the side of the exploiters. He, therefore, knowingly becomes the aider and abettor of the young bourgeoisie, which is plunging into the mire of corruption and pleasure. The economic channels of the young state sink back inevitably into neo-colonialist lines. The national economy, formerly protected, is today literally controlled. The budget is balanced through loans and gifts, while every 3 or 4 months the chief ministers themselves, or else their governmental delegations, come to the erstwhile mother countries or elsewhere, fishing for capital. The former colonial power increases its demands, accumulates concessions and guarantees, and takes fewer and fewer pains to mask the hold it has over the national government. The people stagnate deplorably in unbearable poverty. Slowly they awaken into the unutterable treason of their leaders. This awakening is all the more acute in that the bourgeoisie is incapable of learning its lesson. The distribution of wealth that it affects is not spread out between a great many sectors. It is not ranged among different levels, nor does it set up a hierarchy of half-tones. The new caste is an affront all the more disgusting in that the immense majority, 9/10 of the population, continue to die of starvation. The scandalous enrichment, speedy and pitiless, of this caste is accompanied by a decisive awakening on the part of the people, and a growing awareness that promises stormy days to come. The bourgeois caste, that section of the nation which annexes for its own profit all the wealth of the country, by a kind of unexpected logic, will pass disparaging judgments upon the other Negroes and the other Arabs, that more often than not are reminiscent of the racist doctrines of the former representatives of the colonial power. At one and the same time, the poverty of the people, the immoderate money-making of the bourgeois caste, and its widespread scorn for the rest of the nation will harden thought and action. But such threats will lead to the reaffirmation of authority and the appearance of dictatorship. The leader, who was behind him a lifetime of political action and devoted patriotism, constitutes a screen between the people and of the rapacious bourgeoisie, since he stands surety for the ventures of that caste and closes his eyes to their insolence, their mediocrity, and their fundamental immorality. He acts as a breaking power on the awakening consciousness of the people. He comes to the aid of the bourgeois caste and hides his maneuvers from the people, thus becoming the most eager worker in the task of mystifying and bewildering the masses. Every time he speaks to the people, he comes to mind his often heroic life and struggles he has led in the name of the people and the victories that in their name he has achieved, thereby intimating clearly to the masses that they ought to go on putting their confidence in him. There are plenty of examples of African patriots who have introduced into the cautious political advance of their elders a decisive style characterized by its nationalist outlook. These men came from the backwoods, and they proclaimed to the scandal of the dominating power and the shame of the nationals of the capital that they came from the backwoods and that they spoke in the name of the Negroes. These men who have sung the praises of their race, who have taken upon themselves the whole burden of the past, complete with cannibalism and degeneracy, find themselves today, alas, at the head of a team of administrators which turns its back on the jungle and which proclaims that the vocation of its people is to obey, to go on obeying, and to be obedient till the end of time. So this is where I'm going to stop for part 1. Thank you.